So good morning, or good afternoon actually, if you are not in the UK. Of course, I'm Giovanni De Gregorio and I'm pleased to share this session today of this, I could say, amazing seminar series on AI, hate speech and online content moderation. It is fair to say at the beginning that this series is organized by a group of university that are in Germany, but also in the UK, and especially the Free University Berlin, the Weizsäcker Institute, the School of University also in South Africa, the University of Johannesburg, but also the Center of Socio-Legal Studies and the program in Comparative Media Law and Policy at the University of Oxford. And also what is important to stress once again, and that this project and this seminar series has been possible also to the support of the Oxford Research Fund and the ERC project, especially what we are working on the ConflictNet project in Oxford. So today what we'll do is to continue this seminar series with the second actually session, and this session will deal with the methods in studies AI and content moderation, especially in the Global South. And I would say that this is a very important point because after having provided, a broader framework of the challenges for AI and content moderation and hate speech on a global scale in the first seminar. Also now we are starting to look at how we can, what are the methods that we can use in research to understand what are the challenges raised by this topic, and especially concerning the spread of AI technologies and the increasing intersection with hate speech and the spread of hate speech, also disinformation, especially in Africa, that is actually in Africa or in the Global South, more generally speaking, that is the core and the focus of this seminar series, as the next also sessions in this seminar series will focus on. So this is just to say that we are so happy to introduce actually today our speaker, but we'll introduce, of course, following actually the rolling call. So today we have Eugenia Siapera, Christian Katzenbach, we have Joao Carlos Magales, and Abebayola Bejer. So today we can start this way. I think we can start with Eugenia. And then we will have Christian with Joao and Ade once again. So I have already talked too much, so I will, of course, leave the floor to Eugenia to start the first presentation of this session. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Giovanni, for the introduction. I have to say from the outset that my focus is not on the Global South as such, but I want to do a kind of like the converse kind of movement to begin with theories and critiques that have emerged in the context of the Global South to apply to some of the systems that we're using today in artificial intelligence. I will try to share my screen, so hopefully this is going to work. I don't know, if it's okay, just give me a thumbs up if you can, please, Giovanni or someone.
Yes, we can see that.
Okay, okay, this shouldn't, I don't know if you can see my notes as well, which shouldn't be.
No, in this case, it's...
I never get any of these right.
Actually, we can see the notes because it's not in full screen.
So it says that Zoom has crashed.
You can click on display settings in the middle on the top to make sure that you show only your presentation and not the notes.
Hi, I'm not sure what you can see now because I keep getting messages that Zoom has crashed. So hopefully you can hear me and see me.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. We can hear you.
Anyway, I will start, and if there are any problems, Giovanni, please let me know.
Yeah, the only thing is that
I just want to begin.
No, the only thing is that we cannot, of course, see your presentation.
By identifying some of the main concerns and problems and arguments that I will pursue in this presentation, I want to primarily begin by identifying how artificial intelligence for moderating hate speech is already embedded in systems of domination. And I hope to show this by developing a critique of how artificial intelligence is used in content moderation by platforms, and I mean primarily Facebook. And then I will move on to discuss some broad parameters for a decolonial perspective, and I will end by proposing a set of guidelines for an alternative content moderation system that includes but is not driven by artificial intelligence. So the first kind of like the introduction that I have to this presentation is to discuss very briefly the idea of coloniality of power and decolonial approaches. So this all comes, the way I read it, from the work of a South American theorist called Aníbal Cuyano, who spoke about the coloniality of power, by which he refers to the form that power takes in a world that is formally decolonized, but in reality colonized in different forms. So he moves, and not only Cuyano, but this kind of like school of thought moves from the historical event of colonization to the process of colonialism that involves the continuation of subjugation by other means. So coloniality then is a structural logic that underpins this process. It involves a lot of other sub-processes, but the ones that I want to focus on here are the control of the economy through appropriation of land, exploitation of labor and other kinds of resources, what we refer to as extractivism, and also the control of subjectivity and knowledge through the formation of how subjects are formed, subjectivity is formed. So coloniality is inextricably bound to constructions of race and ethnicity. Cuyano identified the kind of like idea of racial formations as the racial social classification under Eurocentric world power. So basically this idea of whiteness that is a condensed form for the operation of a specific power dynamic that supports the worldviews of the colonizer, justifies logics of extraction and exploitation, while devaluing other forms of knowledge. It basically is a system that perpetuates inequality and domination. So whiteness in this sense, it's not an attribute of a particular race, but a system of power. So with this kind of like broader theoretical framework into mind, I shift gear now towards identifying how artificial intelligence is used by platforms in moderating hate speech. And I contextualize this in a broader ideological context that includes, on the one hand, this kind of like Californian ideology, as Barbrook and Cameron called it, a mixture of cybernetics, free market economics, and countercultural libertarianism, and human rights discourses on the other hand, specifically when it comes to hate speech, the UN Declaration of Human Rights, the International Convention for the Eradication of Racial Discrimination, and in the context of the European Union, the Framework Decision of 2008 for combating xenophobia and racism by means of criminal law. So platforms' policies are nested within these, but focus on operational dimensions. So in other words, how do we in practice operationalize these issues in ways that systems and processes and procedures understand and are built on, and we can build upon. So they do this without recognizing the ideological dimensions of the contexts in which they operate. So we can see this very clearly in terms of how hate speech is nested in the community standards of Facebook. It is just another category 12, if I read here correctly, just above violent content and adult nudity. And it's a very generic definition, a direct attack against people on the basis of protected characteristics such as race, ethnicity, and so forth, but with no concession made to any kind of like historical differences, and no recognition of the fact that in the particular historical context that we find ourselves, anti-Black discourses, anti-Black hate speech is not the same as anti-white hate speech, if we assume that the latter exists. Within the European Union, as I mentioned earlier, we have the code of conduct between the European Union and the platforms that defines illegal hate speech based on this framework decision, which is again generic in this manner, any group of people, any kind of like reference to any race and so forth. There is, however, in the European discourse, a concession to history, which is very, very specific and refers to the crimes of the Second World War as identified in the Tribunal of Nuremberg. but no other kind of like historical reference, for example, to European colonialism and the crimes that emerged through that process. And the code of conduct revolves around 3 pillars. The first is to have clear and transparent takedown procedures, important takedown procedures, to hire more moderators and scale up efforts to remove contents, and to work with civil society, but to work in a very specific way through trusted flaggers and community initiatives. Where does AI fit in this? Well, it emerged in a context where there was not excessive, but like important critiques of human moderation on 3 grounds: that the decisions may be subjective and lacking standardization, that the labor practices and working conditions are not optimal, and that the psychological costs of exposure to hateful contents is important. As a second kind of like parameter is the ideology and identity of Facebook as a tech company revolving around technological innovation. And Mark Zuckerberg himself has discussed artificial intelligence, the use of artificial intelligence through referring to accuracy and consistency, the challenge of scale, and the repetitive tasks that are involved in human content moderation. So this is how artificial intelligence has emerged as the preferred solution to problems of human content moderation, but not necessarily to the problem of hate speech. So the idea here is that artificial intelligence was developed as a way in which they could streamline what human content moderators were doing, but without really touching how hate speech is defined and used in the platforms. So how does Facebook, what kind of system has it developed? Very sophisticated systems. They dazzle with a lot of kind of like technology, technological terms, but in essence, they are classifiers that are getting better and better, more precise in their classification, but they don't do much more than that. They also operate in different languages, and they try to kind of like proactively moderate in the sense that they don't allow content to reach a lot of eyeballs. And apparently, according to the transparency reports of Facebook, they are quite efficient because Facebook reports that that hate speech on the platform has dropped by 0.03% in the 4th quarter, although the main reason was because artificial intelligence was adapted to include content in Spanish and Arabic. So in terms of formulating a critique, as I mentioned earlier, what artificial intelligence in essence is doing is what human moderators do, but at scale and in a more kind of like, I suppose they call it precise and accurate way, but it's not always necessarily this. But it relies on the same definitional context as human moderation, a set of definitions that have been found to operate in a colorblind, post-racial manner without considering historical specificities or experiences or making any distinction between the oppressed and the oppressors. So in sum, the definitions of hate speech revolve around legal interpretations and do not take into account the views, experiences, and input of affected communities. The second aspect, the second part of my critique is how these artificial intelligence systems are trained. And Facebook has not been very forthcoming, but the logical assumption is that systems are trained using pieces of content that were reported and removed as hate speech. In other words, they're built upon the labor of both moderators and those targeted by hate speech and their allies. So in this manner, I suppose what we could see is not only an extraction in terms of the labor, but also the use of this material for Facebook to develop a new technological know-how based on this data that emerged out of the targeting and exploitation of racialized people. So this is why I identify this as a continuation of an extractivist logic, which is linked to colonialism. So resources, knowledge, labor, the time of people who are targeted by hate speech are used with minimal or no compensation, and not necessarily for the benefit of those who are targeted. My third kind of critique is that a more kind of like comprehensive one. It's because targeted communities do not participate in defining what is hate speech, because their experiences of the oppressed and oppressors are equated, and thirdly, because artificial intelligence systems were developed and used by platforms that were developed and used by platforms that rely on exploitation and extraction, artificial intelligence systems end up materializing inequalities and privileging whiteness. By that I mean existing power structures. The view that AI works objectively and recognizes hate speech against any race or ethnicity is precisely such a materialization of inequality, because hate speech does not affect all races or ethnicities similarly, but rather it affects dominated groups and communities disproportionately. So with this in mind, if we shift now to formulating a decolonial approach, I rely a lot here on the work of Rachel Adams, who identified two meanings in decolonizing AI. And the first is to fracture histories and futures that delimit the participation of colonized people. And the second is to identify and undo the legacies of colonialism. So I think based on these ideas, it is immediately clear that the limited and problematic definition of racist hate speech that is embedded in current AI moderation systems is part and parcel of the history of colonialism and the history of race. And because of this, artificial intelligence in content moderation does not help serve the interest of racialized people, but those primarily of platforms. So thinking of decolonizing AI in content moderation as a particular specific technique cannot work. It has to make a clear contribution to ending exploitation and domination that have emerged from the histories of colonialism and racial capitalism. So in this sense, it should be developed within a broader engagement with these legacies and therefore outside of the platforms. It should be seen as part of an arsenal of an approach that seeks to dismantle systems of domination, which include the ways in which speech, discourses, and ideologies circulate and are used to justify current hierarchies and subjugation of other forms of knowing and being. So in this manner, I think that AI is more useful for knowing the way in which race and racism currently operate than for removing or demoting content based on a limited and ultimately problematic definition of hate speech. So I think that a decolonial approach ultimately requires that we rethink the issue of hate speech in terms of its role in perpetuating systems of oppression, and its definitions must emerge from those who are at the receiving end and not from systems, processes involved in the oppressing. It must be developed as part of this broader approach that encodes and operationalizes values of equality, justice, and liberation, and not as a pseudo-techno solution coming from the outside and supposedly saving people who are targeted by hate speech. So this is a kind of like a very schematic representation of what I have been talking about. So decolonial values have to guide this system, this development of artificial intelligence. It has to be trained on data that are produced by people whose input is sought and compensated for. It has to be used as part of a broader approach centering on these principles of equality, justice, and liberation. And it should be under the control of those who develop it and who use it in the interest of the oppressed. And finally, it should aim to repair, heal, educate, and sustain communities, not serve the interests of platforms. So to end here, I am very much inspired by Paulo Freire's approach to the pedagogy of the oppressed, and in particular his theory of dialogical action that is based on cooperation, unity, organization, and cultural synthesis. And I think we can use these principles to apply also to the development of artificial intelligence systems. I think that in its current iteration, artificial intelligence represents and serves a dominant techno-scientific rationality that has been used to perpetuate systems of domination. And for us, the challenge is to ask if we can create systems that embed and represent different values and that serve the interests of freedom and equality. So thank you very much. I will stop here.
Thank you so much, Eugenia. This has been great because it has provided a lot of, or it has actually underlined the lack of nuance sometimes in these studies, especially when we look at some problems, not only in content moderation, but even more generally when we look at hate speech and discrimination. So this also is in a way a trigger also to expand research in the field of the hate speech, once again in AI, to understand what are the challenges for discrimination or for hate when we focus on algorithms or the implementation of automation of expressions, especially in areas where that are characterized by violent conflicts or tensions that, of course, this of course could lead to radicalization or problems that are so close to the spread of hate speech. And also you underline very interesting the problem also of how the system are shaped, governed, or programmed in a way, technically speaking, by entities or, for example, social media, more precisely speaking, that are, of course, that represent a certain perspective of this kind of also of also the understanding, the cultural understanding of free speech and also hate speech, so forth. So this has been a very good introduction also for what I assume Christian and Joao will actually provide us today. So the floor is yours, please.
Yeah, thank you, Giovanni, and thanks, Eugenia, for this wonderful introductory talk. Actually, I think we're gonna in a way, kind of make a step back and put a bit of a kind of broader context, not specifically focused on hate speech and not specifically focused on the Global South, but talking more generally about the automation of content moderation and its context. And I'm doing that together with my colleague, Joao Carlos Migueles at the Humboldt Institute. And I'm sharing my screen now, if that works. Is this good? Does it work?
Yes, it's working.
Okay. All right. So what we're going to do is talk a bit about the general kind of context and the turn to AI in content moderation, as I call it. And then I'm going to give a really kind of broad overview of kind of types and technologies of automated content moderation in the field, not specifically tied to hate speech, but also more generally. There's a lot of these technologies out there, and for quite a while, for example, in copyright identification and filtering. And then Joao will take over and say a few words about methods and how to research that space, which is obviously notoriously intransparent and hard to research. So we're gonna suggest some avenues. And to close, I will talk a bit about kind of the political and social implications of automated content moderation. Probably not surprisingly, there will be some overlaps with what Eugenia already said, but maybe we can bring that into a conversation also after that. And I will try to be not too repetitive. All right, so let's start. So what I always think is a nice illustration of this field and this development was the 2018 Senate hearings of Mark Zuckerberg. So he was more or less, I mean, not really grilled, but he was asked before the US Senate in the aftermath of the Cambridge Analytica scandal. And they were talking about many things, not only about Cambridge Analytica, not only about data that has kind of been kind of diffused across the net and been used for purposes that are not being meant to do, but they were also talking about misinformation, about hate speech. So Mark Zuckerberg was confronted with many of the controversies in that space and many of the problems that Facebook seemed to confront at that time in that very dense 90 minutes meeting, I think. And during that time, I don't know, the counts are different, but something between 15 and 25 times, he said something like, AI will fix this, or in the future, we will have technologies to take care of that. Be it misinformation, be it hate speech, or be it any other problem that was raised in this meeting. And I think that's a nice illustration of what we're currently seeing, or what we have seen in the last 4 or 5 years, I think. That technological solutions are positioned as solutions to much more broader social problems, as Eugenia already has said. I will start with giving a really short, kind of slightly different story than Eugenia on this turn to AI. I think that this is a very important observation that Eugenia has made, that there's kind of this oscillation between the legitimation of how to do content moderation. On the one hand, there's the story of, oh, the labor conditions of our content moderating teams are so bad that we need to turn to AI to make this a kind of a more clean process. On the other hand, then sometimes people are saying, well, you cannot leave this complicated problem to a technology alone. We need to have humans on the in the loop. And then they're saying, okay, we're going to hire another 10,000 content moderators. So there's kind of this oscillating between these two avenues of how to do content moderation. I will now try to highlight some aspects in this very broad turn to AI in this space. And the first one, I'd say, is a discursive turn that is kind of part of a much broader positioning of technologies as solutions to social problems. And AI, of course, I mean, not surprisingly, has been the forerunner of this in the last, I'd say, 5 to 10 years. AI is positioned as kind of the thing, it's the new hype and the solution for many, many problems, including, did I include that? No, I just deleted that. There are even ads for like the best beer or the electronic toothbrush powered by AI, kind of going to places where you would never go with your normal toothbrush. So there's really a lot of funny stuff out there, how AI is being positioned as a solution to some problems we'd never imagined to have in the first place. So there's this broader kind of discursive turn and marketing turn to AI as a solution to X, to whatever. AI will fix this. And content moderation is obviously a very important example currently of this. But it's not only, and then kind of the companies try to position that very broadly to say, okay, we're going to take care of that, and we have these amazing technologies in place. But there is also a political turn to AI. And some colleagues, I think, for example, Julia Hörnle of Queen Mary University of London has called it the unholy alliance of big tech and the governments, where governments, of course, are also pressuring these big companies to take responsibility. And they seem also to believe that AI or other automated technologies might be a solution to that. And you see that in different directions. Probably Giovanni can tell this story better than me, where both regulations, but also court decisions have moved into the directions where providers, platforms, intermediaries, however you want to call them, are taken much more into responsibility for the content that they host. So the kind of the liability privilege that they used to have, that they're not liable for the content that they host if they're not notified, it has been eroding over the last 10 years, I think, with the copyright directive as an example where this has been heavily discussed, where people have been kind of really went to the streets, tens of thousands actually in Germany, to say this regulation will make platform providers all install upload filters, and this will block away much of the creative content that many of us are producing and consuming every day. So this is censorship. So this has been also highly politicized, but there's a general, I'd say a general movement towards taking the platforms much more into responsibility. And one of the ways to do that has been a political turn to automated technologies, and not forcing companies to provide them, but really pushing them into that direction. Of course, there's also a technical turn to AI and to automated technologies. There has been a lot of progress in that space. What I want to say with these 4 turns is that this is not only about technology, because this is a discourse normally that the service providers and the platforms and the tech guys, the tech people are trying to position. Technology is getting better and better, and we'll find a solution. But I want to say there's much more. But yes, obviously, there's also a technical turn. In recent years, specifically in the last 10 years, there has been made, of course, a lot of progress in pattern detection in many different directions. This started probably with ImageNet, this database, and then people applying new methods to detect patterns, and then they're now trying to kind of to make this work, also in terms of, for example, hate speech, as Eugenia has said. And of course, there's also an economical turn to AI, or economic kind of rationale for deploying automated content moderation, because what Ben Crosser in this wonderful art project that I will also post in the chat here has made clear is kind of Mark Zuckerberg's and more generally Silicon Valley fixation on growth and scale as kind of the key imperative. So we need to grow, but how to make content moderation at scale? Obviously, the answer is not hire many more content moderators, but deploy automated means. And AI is kind of the way to go there, obviously. So that's, I'd say, kind of the key turns to AI, or the key factors in turning to AI and automation in content moderation. As Joao and I had tried to highlight in a piece, and some reporters have also observed that, obviously, is that there has been a kind of also a pandemic turn to AI, who has reinforced that development by sending, for example, content moderators home, and given that they didn't have kind of the working space, working environment in the home office that they have in these huge offices. Facebook, Google, YouTube, Twitter turned on their automated mechanisms much more kind of heavily than they had before. So the pandemic had really kind of enforced that development as well. And yeah, as I probably already more or less said, there's this broader momentum of positioning technologies as solutions to social problems, and this is part of the story. Volti has this wonderful notion of a technological fix. Evgeny Morozov, for example, some years ago, has more or less reformulated that with his notion of the technological solutionism. And I think that's a very good explanation of what's happening there. So just to give a very short overview of some of the logics, at least, of the technologies that we have there, is an article with Ruben Binz and Robert Gorva, actually from the University of Oxford. We have tried to classify that a bit into different versions. So technologically, you see that in the identification axis. So you could probably classify them into a match or prediction technology. Matching technologies use an existing database of items that they have and that they want to detect. So think about that in terms of YouTube having a registry of videos and audio material, and they try to check against this database everything that's being uploaded. And if they find a match, then it's being either blocked or monetized according to the wishes of the assumed copyright holder, or the photo DNI database that the big platform providers are sharing with kind of problematic content, and they try to apply that to uploaded content. So this is, you could say, kind of the easy way, right? So matching new stuff against existing problematic or illegal content, maybe. And the second one, which is much more in this context of what people say AI is about, is the prediction thing. So technologies that try to evaluate a new type of a new item of content, not against existing specific content, but against kind of the system that tries to evaluate, okay, is this considered hate speech? So this is more or less what Eugenia has been talking about, and where most of the technologies are still actually quite bad. So they try to, for example, have this toxicity percentage. So this phrase that I'm using or that I've posted to Twitter is like 85% toxic or something like that. The Perspective API, for example, is one provider who's one kind of API that you can use, that you can buy into if you're having a service and you want to apply some of these technologies. So this is broadly what there is out there in terms of systems. And then what the platforms do with that could be either kind of a hard consequence in terms of blocking or removal, or more kind of soft consequence, which is like kind of flagging, where people, for example, Twitter has been using that a lot in the context of the US election. Kind of, we consider this misinformation, or we consider this, be aware this could be kind of hateful content or something like that, or downranking, so that in their algorithmic curation, they kind of apply kind of a negative factor on this type of content to give this kind of less reach and visibility. Those are not kind of censoring or kind of really plucking this out, but just kind of giving it less visibility. So that's kind of the general characteristic of these systems. And yeah, in that article, we try to kind of map out a bit what these different providers are using in terms of evaluating controversial types of content like violence, toxic speech, copyright, child abuse, sexual content. And this is, yeah, it's just some kind of overview. And you see, of course, there are a lot of systems out there, and a lot of platforms are using them for very different types of content. And I think I'm gonna leave it there and hand over to Joao to talk a bit about methods.
Right, thank you. Right, so can you just, yes, this slide. So thank you, Christian. So as you said, I will talk about a little bit on how we can do empirical research on algorithmic content moderation. So ideally, we, of course, would be allowed to audit those systems, speak freely with their inventors, observe their work, and then do deep ethnographic work on automated content moderation. But as we know, it's actually quite challenging. So actually quite hard to do that. I think two main reasons. First and foremost, because platforms, as of course, are controlled by private companies that have long been extremely cagey about their technologies and practices. So our experience shows that platforms do not want to be audited. They will deflect responsibility as much as possible and will deny any sort of wrongdoing until the moment that they're confronted with facts. And of course, getting to those facts can be super hard. Second, even if we had access to those systems, they would remain quite complex from the technical perspective, as any AI to some extent is. So machine learning systems are notorious for being opaque even for their designers, who commonly cannot really explain how the system works or how the system has produced certain outputs. So once we acknowledge those sort of, I would say, general and to a large extent hard to transpose limitations, it's not, of course, impossible to investigate automated content moderation empirically. So while what I will say might apply to different sorts of technologies, most of the things that I'm going to talk about in the next minutes essentially comes from our work here at the Humboldt Institute to understand mostly a particular kind of automated content moderation, which is copyright content moderation, which of course is not disconnected from the sort of potentially it's not disconnected from the sort of issues that Eugenia was talking in the first part of the panel. So let me begin by two approaches that appear quite intuitive, but are actually quite challenging. So from a qualitative perspective, it would be perhaps obvious for us that we might want to speak with the people who have developed these technologies. So interviews with platforms, employees, and technologists are by no means unheard of. They, of course, have happened many times. But I would say that they apparently have become harder to get, and especially hard, I would say, if the interviewer is a researcher who has a critical background towards platforms. Yet, even if interviews are granted, and of course, platforms still grant us with interviews, chances are that they will be tightly controlled, choreographed, and perhaps even misleading. So again, this is nothing new from a broader, I would say, qualitative perspective of doing empirical research. And it's clearly possible to extract a lot of information from even those really controlled interviews. But since we don't have an independent source of knowledge about those systems, I would say that it can be really hard to even understand in which way such interviews would or not be misleading, choreographed, etc. So in some, I would say that any information is in principle valuable, but we should be very, very concerned with the possibility of being played, of reinforcing an agenda that's not an independent agenda, that's the agenda of the platform, of the company. So a second possibility involves using platforms' APIs to extract data directly from the platform. So again, this might seem quite attractive, particularly from a quantitative perspective, especially if we are interested in, for instance, measuring the impact of copyright content moderation on the informational environment of a given platform, what is taken down and what's not. And to be clear, I mean, depending on what we are talking about, this could work. I think the issue here is, again, a matter of control and who is controlling the data. So APIs are 100% controlled by the platforms, and many of their functionalities might be abandoned or even broken up on purpose. And we have sort of there's a track record of companies trying to stop people from getting data from their APIs and changing the API on purpose. So furthermore, I would say it might be quite hard to ensure the accuracy of the data that we get via the API, since again, the researcher does not control the API, and the API might not actually give us as much access to the data as the platform promises it does. So in essence, it's a method that's both unstable and it's very hard to be independently verified. So are there alternatives? Of course, by all means. So let me explore two of them that we have been working on in our project. So one, it seems like quite obvious, but we can simply try to investigate the public information that companies have given us over time about their systems, which involves, for instance, help pages, press releases, public policies, etc. So this method faces some of the same limitations of the interview. So policies and public communications by no means offer a point, sort of a direct knowledge of automated content moderation, sure. But it does offer, I would say, an interesting entry point into companies' institutional performances and a sort of an informational baseline that can be used to hold companies accountable, precisely because the information is public. So, and as interesting as this is for sort of the possibility of, perhaps as interesting as just understanding the performances of those companies is also using tools such as Wayback Machine, which is an archive of websites, the largest archive of websites in the world, to track down the history of those performances and to some extent the history of those tools. So again, this is part of what we're doing in our project. So another possibility involves exploring companies' patents documentation. So digital media companies have traditionally used patents as a way of claiming intellectual rights over their functionalities, over their technologies. And that also includes automated content moderation. So these documents are written in a very dry and technical style, but when you read through them, you can actually see that they contain a lot of really valuable information. But of course, these methods are, again, limited. So policies and public communications not only offer a very limited understanding of what content moderation does in practice, they might be explicitly misleading and tainted by marketing narratives, for instance. Also, the Wayback Machine, from the historical perspective, is full of holes. You cannot say that the Wayback Machine has really tracked down every single URL of all platforms. And in the case of patents, is a bit more complicated, as the fact is that no one knows for sure if the invention that is described in the patent is actually being used by the company. So perhaps my overall point is that once we acknowledge the limitations, I think both methods can offer some interesting perspectives to empirically research content moderation. And with that, I return the ball to Christian. Thanks.
Sorry. Okay, thanks, Joao. Yeah, I'm gonna try to keep that very short because I think we're already kind of running out of time. So I just wanted to conclude with some kind of politics of automated content moderation. And actually by that, I mean, it's easy to talk about the failures of these systems. But when I was trying to think about the politics of this, is also kind of, even assuming they were technologically quite perfect, there's still a lot of politics involved. And of course, I mean, transparency has been highlighted a lot. I think fairness and justice as well. And Eugenia is making very good points in that space. So I just wanted to use my remaining seconds, minute to talk about depoliticization and number set, too big to be responsible. So the issue of depoliticization is that I'm concerned with, if we are kind of moving more and more of these questions into automated processes, actually into infrastructures of our communication systems, I fear that we lose track of the underlying political decisions or social decisions that they implement. So where's the gray line between hate speech and freedom of expression? So what is about kind of misinformation or disinformation campaigns and just kind of a very kind of popular spin of a tabloid newspapers? So where are all these gray lines? This is something we need to talk about as a society. And if we kind of move all that into perfectly functioning infrastructure, we lose track of these decisions, I would argue. And I mean, as a social scientist, I always have the intuition to say, okay, this is not gonna work anyway. So maybe we shouldn't fear so much about it. But think about spam, for example. Think about other example where we heavily rely on automated procedures. And so this might not be too far ahead that we do kind of rely on these systems to take care of some of these problems. So that's the first point that I'm concerned about, or that I want to highlight today, is kind of this infrastructurization of political issues and then becoming kind of invisible for us and depoliticized. And the second one is this last point that I wanted to highlight here. With these points, I want to highlight there are many issues, but the final point is maybe kind of the hidden elephant in the room, that sometimes we seem to assume that these companies are so big and that they want to grow more and more. And this obviously makes it very hard to do content moderation at scale and to be responsible for, like, I don't know, much more probably than 2 billion messages or content items each day. Obviously, we see this is very hard. But you could also ask, I mean, well, maybe that is the problem. Maybe they're just too big to be responsible, and we don't need to find solutions for them to be so big and to scale content moderation so far. So maybe that is rather the problem than kind of the starting point. So yeah, I guess that's it. And it was a very broad take, I guess, on automated content moderation, but I hope there's some constructive aspects in that. So thanks a lot for inviting us.
Thank you, Christian, and thank you, Joao. This is, once again, has been really interesting. I'm really curious to see how also how the first few presentations are connected with each other, you know, also how we can implement and use these tools also for implementing the consideration that Eugenia underlined before. So this would be a very interesting exercise, first of all, to mix these two areas of research, you know, but I'm pretty sure that Ade could add some very interesting insights on how we can also create more this bridge between, you know, the research field we are addressing, and of course we are sure we will provide very interesting methods and other opportunities to study the connection between AI and of course content moderation, so the use of AI in content moderation and hate speech, and of course we will provide a good understanding also of these problems in the global south. But as usual, I've talked too much, and so Ade, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Giovanni. I just want to confirm that everyone can see my screen.
Yes.
Great stuff. So, so the first two presenters, it's almost like we are telepathic now, as if what you're thinking, I also have similar thoughts, especially for the presentation from Christian and from Carlos. There were things that you mentioned about APIs that are going to kind of like resurface here. But then I'm happy that I was kind of able to be the tech guy. All right, everybody always blames the tech guy. So I'm the tech guy now. So I kind of, in my presentation, I kind of like started from the basics, took you back to what AI was actually designed to be all about. Then a little bit of the journey, touched on your base as well, hate speech, and in an African context, what it means to Africa, what has happened in terms of gravity of things like genocide in a country like Rwanda, based on hate speech in the early 90s. Then towards the end, I kind of like now got technical, a little bit technical, not to scare the audience, but just to kind of tell you what is out there and what you can actually plug in as a social scientist or as someone in humanities towards the end of towards your research, something you can use, something that's readily available. So, hence, these are the things I decided to go with in this presentation. First, just discuss how AI dictates hate speech. Then bring in the humanities and social science into the picture. You know, like, you know, no matter how technical things get, there's always a way to explain it. Especially the black box, we call it the black box. And the the African context of things, because the interest is towards many African languages that are not even available in APIs or available in many, many other platforms. So this is the way my presentation will go. I'll start with AI and content moderation generally. Then I'm going to talk about hate speech, what is hate speech and why do people, because again, we believe as scientists that to solve a problem, we actually have to understand why. How would someone sit on their couch with their cell phone and actually make 100,000 people in the world sad? It's an interesting question. So I actually did some digging into that, and I have some things on that. Detecting hate speech, the trends, the tools, and the methods. That's a little bit technical. Then this last stage, which is the tools for social scientists and humanities, are things that I believe that someone in humanities or social sciences can actually pick it up without actually knowing how to write software or you don't have to be a software developer. You can pick those things up and build stuff around them or do analytics around those things and have good research directions from that point. So content moderation. So first, what is AI? So again, remember I told you I had to like go to the basics, kind of build up an argument. AI is just a machine with a mind. So it took time to do it. We are even lucky that our computers are faster now and we have more data generated by ourselves. And we are at the stage that we are telling the computers to look at our data to give us insights. So again, if the computer could look at it and give us good insights that we agree with, then we can say that computer is intelligent. So there are many kind of definitions. However, the things that stick out are things that learning. A computer must be able to learn. Reasoning, must be able to reason given certain facts. Self-correction, if it needs to iterate and say, okay, I made a mistake and go back like humans do, should be able to do that. Thinking humanly and rationally, especially with self-driving cars, you want those things. Acting humanly and rationally, obviously you don't want a robot that slaps everyone around the room. So those are the things that are the pillars of AI right there. Another definition that is so simple is computation plus cognition. So put a brain in a computer, then it becomes AI. Okay. All right, so can computers be truly intelligent? That's a philosophical question. So I'm sure my colleagues in philosophy enjoy that because there are many philosophical angles to that. People say, no, it cannot be truly intelligent. However, there is an agreeable point, which we call the Turing test. If a computer can fool humans into thinking it's actually human, then we sometimes regard that computer as intelligent. And to do that, it has to be able to do these things. Natural language processing, it has to be able to speak and to listen. When it speaks, that's language understanding. When it listens to you, that's understanding. When it speaks back to you, is generation. So it has to be able to generate a language, maybe English, maybe German, maybe Swahili, and then speak back to you. Knowledge representation, it has to be able to store what it knows and then reason around those things it knows. And finally, it has to learn how to evolve in its environment, in the world where it finds itself. So in AI is very broad. People speak about it thinking it's just one simple little thing. So it's nice to kind of put the task into three perspectives. The first one is, we call it mundane tasks. Those are things that you and I do every day. We don't even know we're doing them. So like we see and we feel. So we call that perception in computer and in AI. So we call it computer vision. We use sensors for it sometimes when we want the AI to feel emotion or a touch or things like that. Computer that can speak and understand what you're saying, that's natural language processing. It's an entire domain. A lot of experts are in that space. Again, that's a space that has to do with hate speech recognition. So machines that can find their way around, robotics, those are always the mind-blowing ones. And common sense, you want a machine to be able to have common sense. And again, finally, thinking is coming back and planning. It must be able not to just make an action in the moment, but be able to make futuristic plans. So other tasks, we categorize them as both formal tasks and expert tasks. Those things, you see them every time in your hospital, in your clinics and things like that. For formal tasks, if your machine is able to solve mathematical equations like humans would, prove theorems, and even play games like chess. You know, the Deep Blue was defeated the chess champion in '97. So those kind of AI systems are regarded as doing the formal tasks. And expert tasks are the AIs you find in things like medical sciences and the likes of engineering, et cetera, et cetera. So how do these AI applications or these AI tools or methods or models, how do they get to do these things? There are two ways to go about it. In the 80s, 70s, 80s, 90s, when these things were very at the early primitive stages, If you know the rules you want the machine to follow, then you just put the rules in. We call them production rules. So it was relatively easy to create them. An example was Mycene in 1984. Mycene was a medical diagnosis system. It just asks you a couple of questions and does a permutation and checks and then says, this is what's wrong with you. However, we've moved on from that. So now we have data. So machine learning, and as we have it now, deep learning, which is like many levels of learning, allows you to then give the data to the machine and just leave the machine to it. And the machine then comes back with some results afterwards, some knowledge. Let's call it knowledge for the sake of argument. So again, to be able to do this, we had to first grow in the data we generated thanks to the internet. We generated so much pictures, so much text, it was easy. Also, we needed quick computers because our average machines could not do this. So high performance computers were another innovation that made these things possible. So like some of you have mentioned earlier on when you were discussing, bias is a huge, huge problem in AI. Again, if you think of AI as this big stuff, think of it like statistics. For 1% of miss or 1% of lack of accuracy, you're going to get something that is imprecise. And if it's imprecise, it could actually hurt someone. So in this case, AI has been analyzed by many researchers about the bias in data, especially for the continent of Africa. Here is a good example from 2015, but discussed in the work of Crowd 2016, where Google Photo app actually picked up a picture of a couple, a black couple, and they said it was gorillas. And then I know the media actually enjoyed discussing that news. Then also we have cameras that think Asian people are blinking every time. We also have like web cameras that actually thought, you know what, people are actually not existing when they actually did because their skins were darker and things like that. So that's the bias that comes with things. Content moderation, I think Kristen touched on this a little bit. Again, it's not just it's speech. We moderate, usually AI is deployed to moderate cyberbullying, pornography. Hate speech is one of the major things. And moderation is usually done, again, I saw this with earlier speakers, flagging. Sometimes you use like another API to flag, meaning that you consult a company that's good at fact checking, and Facebook uses that company and as a third party to check something for them, and then they now pull it down or they make it unavailable. But this is the space of AI here, where you actually get a machine to do it. An example is a photo DNA, which I think came up with Christian's presentation, if I was correct. Hate speech. Again, we all know what it is. I just decided to touch on this because of the broader audience, in case someone else is listening and just thinking, someone not in humanities, maybe my fellow scientists. So anything that just breaks people's hearts, essentially, and they say, why do you say that to me? Sometimes it's as simple as that. Then sometimes it's funny to the guy that's posting it, but to the other people, it's not funny because it's about an historical event that still touches people's hearts. So why do people do it? This was an interesting one for me because I was going to just go with this and I decided, you know what, let me just see what's in the literature. And I was actually agreed. First, people could sense of belonging. I want to belong to a bad gang, you know, like some bad boys, and that's what they do. Sense of power, because I want people to beg me about the country I'm at and to stay in my country and things like that. Supremacy, importance, etc. Internet. People have access. So back in the day, we didn't even know this was a huge problem because nobody could go to Twitter and tweet anything they wanted. Devices are getting cheaper as well. So you can just buy an Android phone as opposed to even year 2000 where not everybody could do it. Increasing access, social media allows you to do it, especially Twitter, just post whatever you want. There are measures, but then unlike other platforms that are more stricter, then difficult policing, people can just say my name is J001. You don't know the house address and things like that. In Africa, again, like I said when I began, Rwanda is one of the African countries that understands the power of hate speech because the country actually has an history of that, where there was a genocide based on a minority tribe being called names on radio every day until people actually started killing them. Then religious conflict in Sub-Saharan Africa, again, it's been attributed to a lot of hate speech, with divisions between religions, between tribes, and and things like that. So why is this a difficult task? Why can't Mark Zuckerberg just flip a coin and get this done? This is why. So collecting and annotating data, for major languages, this has been done, and I'll show you some data sets more later, later on in my presentation. However, for many other languages, this has not been done. So it's a lot difficult. So if I post a tweet and I use my native language, Yoruba, for example, as subtext of the main text, then you might not be able to pick it up that there's hate speech in it. Free speech versus hate speech. This is the political challenge that I think Carlos and Christian touched on earlier on, because there's also politics in the whole picture. When it's free speech, hate speech, you know what I'm saying? In America is a good example. In America, it's 50-50 if you look at the election numbers from the last time. So what is hate for someone? It's just I'm expressing my mind. So again, if humans cannot decide what hate speech is, how do you expect a machine to decide what hate speech is? Because the machine is consuming the data from humans. Well, for the extreme cases, the machine can decide, but for the borderline cases, it becomes tricky. Access to data, Twitter is very open. Now this is better. However, there's no African continent representation in these data sets. So you have to keep that in your mind. When you think there's data somewhere, then Africa is not represented. Most of the time, not all the time. So text, images, and languages. Sometimes the hate speech is a picture of someone and then it's a joke. So you have to extract the picture, extract the text. Then you have to look at the languages as well. So if it's many, and the many languages, you know what, as you might have guessed. Many African languages they're not available for these technologies. So let's look at what has been done real quick. Stereotype has been used as a way to kind of categorize hate speech with technology. So if there are things that are stereotypes like phrases and keywords, they're kept in a kind of like a bag, and they're used to check tweets to see if it's hate speech or not. Then Deep 8 uses, now this is machine learning, this is the actual technical stuff, call it deep neural networks, as layers and layers of learning on data. So the machine is allowed to learn for a long time on a data set to see if this is, and this is available as well on Twitter. Hate speech detection in Indonesia. So some people are taking it into their hands to kind of do it for their own language as well. 8base is a Twitter API and platform where you can just use it. It covers 95 plus languages, and over 175 countries is where those languages are spoken. You can just click on the link and then just play with it. It allows you to just dictate if something is hate speech or analyze. Gives you like reporting and analytics and all of that. And 8val is a piece of research work that actually look at a subclass of the whole hate speech class to say, how about when women are targeted? Is it easy to pick it up? Or how about when immigrants are targeted? Because immigrants usually have a phrase people refer to them as, all right? So it could be, yeah, maybe it's easy. So that's a research work on that. For the big tech giants, and I know previous speakers also spoke about them. Yeah, absolutely. These guys have been busy. Apart from the simple stuff, like just telling you that this video has been forwarded many times on WhatsApp. They have third-party checkers for facts checking, for hate speech checking. And it helps them. They also reduce distribution. On WhatsApp, you cannot forward to, I think, more than 5 people. They remove it when they are certain that this hate speech is deleted from the platform. You can even get blocked, even if you are a president, and you know what I mean. So matching. So on Facebook, there's what you call sim search net++. So it indexes images and then just checks for the character of the images. So that another image pops up, it's already been flagged as an image that's hate speech, then the rest one gets classified. Object DNA allows you to check for objects that are major objects in the picture. And if the object is, the surroundings is changed, then it can check that I've seen this object before, even though it looks like this guy's on the yacht. I know he's in a living room and this is fake or things like that. Laser is another one that covers many languages for text. Then deep fake detection model is actually what Facebook is investing in right now. So Facebook is spending so much time on this project to make sure that they can pick up hate speech and stuff like that. It also uses what we call deep neural networks, which is like artificial intelligence on steroids. So the data set is, the machine is going through layers and layers of this information to make sure that it's more precise. So social sciences and humanities, I'm closer to the end now. I think when I got this invitation, I thought I wanted to leave social sciences with something. something that they can, if they are interested in quantitative research, they can probably play around with and probably write some new research papers and handles into what they do. First, Google launched this data set, this is search.research.google.com. It's a platform that allows you to search for any data set sets in healthcare, in any field at all, engineering, poverty data set, whatever it is you want to get. And it's reliable from reliable sources. So they currently have, if you go to that link and you check for hate speech, you search for hate speech, you're going to find over 100 data sets on hate speech. So you can do whatever you like with it. So you have the data sets, probably tweets or Facebook posts and things like that. And you can actually do things like word cloud. You can put up a visualizer to see what's going on. You can do your analysis. Another one is MMHS 150K. It's known as the largest, this from Twitter, largest hate speech repository, data repository. You can check that one out as well. And as someone in social sciences or humanities, you might just want to do something as soft as visualizing the data. Maybe there's a keyword that kept coming back, you know. Just want to make an inference from it. You don't have to do the rocket science. And maybe keyword analysis, or you can even speak to a friend that is a computer scientist or in engineering who can actually do the deep science. Now you can write an interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary research papers based on it. So APIs, again, in the previous conversation, you probably heard about APIs as well. So for APIs, these are tools that have already been created. These machines have been trained to pick up hate speech. So all you have to do is to probably pay or use them for free. However, some of them are so easy to use for even a layman. So like the first one, if you go to this website right now as I speak to you, you create an account that is free. You can actually put a text and it can give you a number to tell you how much of a hate speech is in that text. So you might refer your students to it, your postdoctoral students, and then if you purchase the API, you can also be able to go through a particular subset of text. You might be looking at, say, hate speech, maybe a particular industry, like say, maybe in hospitality and things like that. And that could create a whole different research area for you and your student. Here are some other parallel ones you can check out yourself. Azure as one, and then DZone as one as well. Conclusions. I touched on content moderation, hate speech, why it is difficult for the machine. Obviously, there is no data for many languages, and humans themselves struggle between freedom of speech and hate speech. So the research trends and tools, I picked up a few research work to show you, but there's a lot out there that's been done. The trends and the tools that are available, the APIs. Data set, I've shown you where to find them, what exists and where to find them. Again, don't forget that in Africa, this is under-resourced. So there's not a lot for the African continent. Tools that you can plug in like APIs, plug and play. I call them plug and play because you don't actually need to be a scientist to use those tools. What should you be working on if you're in social sciences and humanities? I think since for the things that we have the data already, I think you can analyze them and just visualize them and write good research papers and provide new insights into the problem. If you're tech savvy, obviously, if you know the rules for picking up what hate speech is, you can actually train or teach your students or create stuff like serious games and to teach concepts in hate speech. And in these serious games, label data can be at the back end. And when the players are playing, it can ask the student, is this hate speech or not? The person can say yes or no, and that they could get some scoring in the game. And that could actually be contributing towards solving the problem, because changing the behavior of people, it's a lot more easier than relying 100% on technology. So if you have tech collaborators, I'm a computer scientist. If anyone is interested in collaborating, one could automate those APIs and look for new applications in the society in a particular space, maybe amongst a particular minority group, and see how it can help them. Multidisciplinary research for big teams, if you can collaborate with science and engineering and actually build new language models, and that's the future. So you can look at a language in Africa like Swahili, like Zulu, like Igbo, Yoruba, Hausa, and you can build a whole language model that picks up hate speech for that language. That would mean that you would have to gather and label data in those languages, and you need data collection centers and things like that. And you probably need the handshake of social media platforms as well. So thank you. That's what I have for you. And thank you for the opportunity to share.
Thanks. Thank you so much, because this is, as we expected in a way, has been really important also to connect with the other presentations, because it provides us with other tools and also possibilities to study hate speech that, as we have underlined also from the first presentation, is not just a monolith. It's not just, you know, one definition. There is no one definition. Of course, it depends a lot on the cultural understanding, once again, of free speech, but also, you know, on the language that is used, that sometimes we are aware that is not available. But this is what happened also, if you think about also in Myanmar with Facebook. And one of the problems was that precisely that content moderation could not always understand or find, for example, hate speech or disinformation in other languages that are actually a little bit outside than English. This is just to introduce, I will say, since I think there could be different questions that you can put on the Q&A, but I think it is just to start the Q&A now, the part of the Q&A. Then we have still 20 minutes, and all of you, of course, are much welcome, even the speakers, of course, to interact with each other and raise questions. I don't know if Nicole and Martin would like to start, you know, I don't know, maybe abusing of their positions, I don't know, or maybe someone from the public, you know, want also to raise hands or use the Q&A function, please.
No, thank you, Giovanni. If it's okay, I do have a question, and I think it's actually for all of the panelists, but probably particularly for Eugenia and for Ade. So Eugenia, you were speaking about you know, the importance of data produced by people whose input is sought. So what I understood from you was you're basically suggesting that you need to go to the communities to get better definitions of what hate speech is. And I think that's a particularly relevant issue for what we're speaking about in Africa. But how feasible is that? You know, taking a country like Ethiopia, where there's 70 different languages spoken, you know, and there's, you know, hundreds and hundreds of languages across the continent, and different communities have very different perceptions of what hate speech might be. How would one approach this? I don't know if either of you have any thoughts on that.
Thanks for this, Nicole. In fact, I was involved in a project, I suppose, relatively early project doing precisely this. So we received funding from the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission and the Irish Research Council to work on a project that was based precisely on generating definitions from the community and then operationalizing this was back in the day where you had access to Facebook API. So we developed our own tool using neural networks to identify racist speech based on definitions that we derived from the community. And our approach was based on identifying groups coming from representing communities and anti-racist groups, so not random people from the streets, but community representatives who are trained and have thought about this matter a lot, and who are also themselves at the receiving end of a lot of racist hate speech. So our definitions, and then myself and the other social scientists were also trained in critical race theory, and we come from this perspective. So we approach this matter from this perspective. So it's not that you just like randomly get people from the street, but get people who have like a background in this, either through community advocacy or working for communities or representing communities. And then what we did was to interview them and derive more kind of like a nuanced understanding of how they understood racist speech, which was very, very different to how either random people understand it or how platforms understand it. So they were viewing it from the point of view of racism, anti-racism. And then we try to kind of like use this understanding in classifying materials, which we then fed to the system to train it. So that's how we approached it. So I think it is feasible. If we did it with like limited funding and a team of like 3 people, essentially, I'm pretty sure that platforms and others can do it as well. It's just that they don't want to do it.
Yeah, maybe I can just weigh in very generally. I think there's this huge tension between the platform's ambition to be global platforms and to scale, and I think there's still kind of sticking to that very kind of strongly, and these questions of kind of context, nuances, and localization of these questions. And of course, this is so important. And I think platforms are kind of trying to bring in a way, expertise, or kind of establishing formats of bringing in like NGOs and people into their processes of rulemaking. But as far as I see it, they're not kind of taking the direction of, kind of really systematically localizations or something like that. Also in our research on where we look at all these platform policies over the course of the years, we see that these rules are kind of changing a lot, they're expanding a lot, but they're actually what I thought would be a very kind of hard data and archiving problem, that there would be so many different versions of these rules. For example, Facebook's community guidelines. This is not the problem. The community guidelines are still global. So there's no kind of delineation between kind of the European version or the US or the African version. So this is still global. And this is a strong indicator, I think, that there's still, they're still playing that global community game. So we're a community of 3 billion people, which is just kind of from a social science view, just not working. Of course, the community needs to have shared sets of understandings and rules and norms, and this is not working. But they're still kind of trying to play that game. I think they probably should change that. But of course, it's a massive effort, and it's also a challenge to their understanding of scaling and business models.
Abe, you want to add something?
Yeah, I think when it comes to actually speaking to the people on the grassroots, I think, yes, the tech giants are beginning to have this investment in Africa where they come around, they set up data centers, set up research institutes, and they invite people to be part of it, the locals. And data collection is one of their biggest agenda as well. So I believe, I agree with that. You know, you rather just be on ground and get also linguistic scholars in those languages involved so that you can actually build good language models. So I think that's just, I think that's a good one.
Okay, so we also have different questions and comments in the chat, and I'm going, of course, I'm looking from the top to the bottom and see that there is Mati that is commenting, and I think also this is more a comment maybe for Eugenia, that because he's commenting on the possibility to rethink decolonization, looking at necropolitics, and basically the question is, if this could be an interesting way also to reframe this debate, and also to think and to move the debate about decoloniality or decolonization beyond the Western debates. I am not reading, of course, the comments because Matty has been so kind to write a very a rich comment, but it's just, I think it's a question for Eugenia, but of course it's for all the panel if you want to engage with it. And then we can move to the other question. So please.
Yeah, thanks very much for this, Marty. Yeah, absolutely, I agree. And it speaks to what Christian was mentioning before, that there is a tension between what Facebook and the platforms are trying to do, which is one solution for everyone, and the needs on the ground that are very, very different. Because of course, it's one thing to receive, like, you know, a rude comment on Facebook, and another thing to call for like genocide or violence. So obviously, what I think emerges here is that there isn't any kind of like magic bullet solution through artificial intelligence systems, which I'm sure you know already. I am very inspired by Akil and Member's work on this, and I will definitely try to incorporate it more in advancing this kind of line of thought forward. So thanks for this, yeah.
Okay, if anyone else do not want to engage with this question, then we have another question from Josh that said that this is a very good point, actually, that is always discussed, because it says about communities that we address, that the global scale of this platform do not allow to have communities, or they do not take enough care about communities. But the question is, this is even true? So we have evidence that platforms sometimes do not care about communities. And I can also say that maybe sometimes there is a very interesting discussion. So there are very interesting statements of some years ago about Mark Zuckerberg then says that communities needs a very strong leader, and the strong leader should guide this community. And it's interesting to see how the idea of the strong leader could also guide communities, and the idea of the communities guided by a strong leader is something that is a little bit far from governing communities in a democratic way. But this is just for you, if there is any evidence about if platforms are aware of these communities, if they are doing something also in content moderation or AI for representing more these communities. Anyone?
Yeah, if I could begin to answer this. This is obviously a difficult question, but I think that Facebook is involved in like diversity initiatives. So, for example, you have a team that includes perhaps people from different ethnicities, and I'm pretty sure they're doing well in these terms. But the extent to which these ethnicities actually represent communities is a very different one. So, for example, yes, I'm from Southern Europe, but I don't represent my country. The same as like a Black computer scientist does not represent necessarily like, you know, the whole of this community, or that they wouldn't necessarily assume an anti-racist perspective because they are computer scientists. They don't kind of like have this knowledge. So I'm talking about specific engagement with specific communities in their capacity as representing communities, not like a random person who is like, you know, maybe a woman or ticks diversity boxes. That's basically the difference, the way I understand it. And in this way, I don't think Facebook has done anything. In fact, I was in an event that Facebook organized a couple of years ago where their engagement was to offer free vouchers for advertising to communities. And this pretty much sums up the degree of their engagement. I know I'm being very critical, but I just want on purpose to kind of like maybe challenge the platforms to do better and to be deeper in their engagement and in the way in which they approach this question, because it does have an impact on these communities, ranging from you know, mental health issues to economic vandalism. And I don't think they are doing enough at the moment.
If I could add something, I mean, it's not exactly about if you mean communities, sort of a minorities, but I would point, Josh, to a series of reports that have been recently published by The Guardian, where they have had access to firsthand information and data showing that Facebook knew that some leaders from, let's say, smaller countries that apparently don't really generate a lot of bad press, they knew that those leaders were engaging in hate speech, or that those leaders were essentially breaking the rules of Facebook, and they didn't act. Right, so platforms have a very strong incentive to not act against, not generally, I would say, hate speech, but in particular, powerful people waging hate speech. So I would point you to those Guardian pieces. They actually have been published in the past 2 weeks, so it's very fresh.
And so I don't know if anyone else wants to add something on that, but there is also a question for Julia, because we are a little bit going to run out of time in a couple of minutes. But to say there is also, in a way, a difference between micro communities and macro communities, and also in small social media and also large social media. Do you think also that there could be possibility to find also alternative way rather than delete content, depending on whether we are dealing with, you know, small communities or large communities in small or large social media? So because this of course raise questions also about how to also research about the communities, how we can define communities, and also how AI should be designed depending on if we identify some communities, of course, because the same maybe AI application maybe get at scale, of course, on a global perspective, could not work for a micro community, and of course, vice versa. So this maybe is a question that maybe we should ask, whether we should just focus on the platform as on a whole community as they pictured that, or maybe if we need to develop also research tools also concerning more nuanced research tools concerning also small communities or even small platforms. I don't know if you want to add something on that. is not an easy question. It's even harder than the question that we raised before, I would say. Okay, so I know that this is a really hard question, and this is true. Even in my case, I can think about that. Anytime we focus on content moderation, anytime the question is yes, but what about the interest of other communities? And actually, if I can share with you, for example, an example. We worked recently. I worked last year actually on a paper, on a research that tried to find alternative remedies also to content moderation, looking at, for example, at the field of contract law. And one of the problem was exactly to understand what is the harm that users are subject when platforms decide to remove content. And so these research questions leads us to question about, but does users have the same interest, have the same also, we can say, expectation in relation to what platform promise or state in their terms of services? So the question is there a general common goal that the platform, of course, try to achieve relation? I don't know, we want to achieve or foster freedom of expression on a global scale, but how communities are, embed the interests and the values of our communities are embedded within, for example, a big or a macro social media. And of course, if we look at the documents they publish, we cannot see this kind of nuance of consideration of different communities. So the question once again is how we can also frame and understand what also micro communities expect from Facebook and what are their expectations in these spaces. Because of course, users, of course, are different, not only because of geographical reasons, but also for cultural and so forth. So they can also expect that platform behave in a different way in relation to their content. And so this is important also to understand how about bottom-up pressure in the field of content moderation. So how users can push the platform working in micro communities to change a little bit the global scale in which macro platforms work. So these are, of course, all kind of, I would say, interesting research perspectives that, of course, face the challenges that we address today, also the lack of transparency and accessibility of, some APIs or some other technologies that this platform make available or they do not want to make available. So I would say that we are very close to the end. If there are not any other question, I would say that we can wrap up. If you agree with that, can we wrap up? Martin? Okay, so I would say so. Amazing.
I don't know if I want to step in to wrap up. I just wanted to refer one of the last questions of an anonymous participant to our discussions of our last workshop, because the last time we discussed the basics of definition of hate speech and these general aspects. So that was the place where we had a broader discussion on that. But I mean, the reference you brought here is I think it is quite helpful, because hate speech is not any kind of harmful speech, but it is a speech that refers to de-individualize people and refers to group characteristics like ethnic characteristics and such things. So that, I think that should be the basis of what we're discussing here. But if I'm allowed to do a personal wrap up, then I learned a lot here from these perspectives, and to my impression, they all were quite complementary to have this critical perspective on AI application. We had this political, analytical perspective that analyzes a little bit the dimensions of this hate speech debate. And finally, which I liked very much, the presentation of Abhijit, given us a lot of resources to step in and do practical hate speech analysis, particularly the perspective that will be important for us in the next two seminars we have, and that is to turn more to the Sub-Saharan African context next time, with the East African context, and the next but one time the West African context. That will give us the opportunity to approach very much this specific African context, which, and I would subscribe to that, is very much under researched at the moment, and particularly of interest for us here. So I hope that we are following a development, learning from previous seminars, and thus build up a pile of knowledge that helps us to approach our research questions at the end in a much better way.
Okay, sounds great. So having said that, with this amazing closing, I would say thank you so much, Martin, of course, for that. I would say that we can, of course, thank you once again, our speakers. It has been a pleasure, and also to all the attendees, also for these questions. And I would say we'll meet the next time. Please register to the next seminar that we'll dig in much more into the research about Africa this time. And so you have just to register and be with us, and more. And if you have any question, please feel free to reach, I would say, the speakers, but also in our case, me or Nicole or Martin, whatever you want. Okay, so thank you so much and have an amazing day. Bye.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Bye.